Good afternoon. This is my third DevOps Days. I've spoken at DevOps Days Boston and Chicago. I actually got a job at Slalom by actually going to the Chicago event. So go to DevOps Days, you may get a job from the experience. And I noticed that they printed the names of the speakers on the backs of the shirts. So you've been carrying me on your back all day long. Thanks for the ride. Really appreciate that. I want to talk about leadership today because I've always been fascinated by leadership, especially once I started leading software development teams almost 20 years ago. And one reason that I love Agile software development is because it is really the perfect way to lead cross-functional teams. Teams that are composed of DevOps, developers, QE, designers. Agile is really fit for purpose for that type of software development. But over the past few years, I've come to see the Agile Manifesto as a great model, not just for building software, but also for building teams, for building customer relationships, and for having better products that we deliver to those customers. And so I'm going to get to the values and the leadership lessons that I've gleaned from the Agile Manifesto and that I will share with you. But I first want to share with you my leadership journey and how I found different stops on that journey that made me a better leader. And really, that journey started when I was young. Now, I've always loved heroes. And when I was young, I spent a lot of time reading comic book heroes and fantasy and science fiction heroes and playing Dungeons and Dragons and making up my own heroes. But I found that there was a reason that I loved hero stories so much. And I didn't know the mechanics of heroes until I went to college, and I was introduced to a book by Joseph Campbell called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And some of you may even remember this cover. You probably found earmarked cover in your college libraries or maybe in high school. And the description from that book is this paragraph, which really is a broad outline of the hero's journey, but it's kind of thick. So I wanted to go through the cycle of the hero's journey. And I didn't know this at the time, but Campbell's book would become a model for a key part of my leadership style. Now, there are a lot of variations on the hero's journey, and so you'll see people structure it in different ways. But Christopher Vogler made a summary of the hero's journey like this, and that there are these 4 parts to the hero's journey. There's the call to adventure, right, where you're called out to solve some kind of problem, and then you go through trials that grow you and develop your character, and then there's the transformation, that the trials transform you into a better person, and then there is the road back, where you go home, because every hero has to eventually go home. And there are a lot of parts to the hero's journey, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the call to adventure, you're living in the ordinary world, and you're called to this supernatural world, and then you often meet a mentor, who is someone who has been on a journey before you and guides you. And then you have the transformation. You go through the ordeals that make you into a better person. There's some kind of reward or a boon that you bring back when you come home to the ordinary road, to the ordinary realm. And so remember, there's kind of this division in the hero's journey between the ordinary and the supernatural. And I really found a lot of analogies between the hero's journey and my journey through code. And I found that there was, like in Campbell's cycle, you have the supernatural and you have the ordinary world. I found that there was a schism between the personal world and the programmatic world, meaning that as I got into software development and I learned the craft and I began to lead teams, I realized that a lot of what I learned when I started programming could apply to the real world, right? The boom that I brought back from my software development journey was critical thinking, the ability to think and analyze problems. And so I found that there was a lot of overlap between the hero's journey and my journey through software. And but I encountered trials, and my trial was a book called Data Structures in C, which many of you probably read. And I almost became a pre-med major when I was in my engineering undergrad, but I persevered and I passed that class. And so I persisted, but then I realized that there were these benefits. But when you get these benefits from programming, who do you pass those benefits to? Who do you pass the boon to? And the mentor relationship was something that I really found compelling, that the mentor and hero relationship was something that would become a part of my leadership style. Because really a mentor is just someone who completed the hero's journey and is helping someone else start their own hero's journey. And so the hero's journey helped me see the link between the journeyer and the journey guide. And that's what technical leaders do. We guide other people on our team on a path that we've already walked to help them walk it a little bit better than we did. But that really didn't help me understand why an old hero would help an experienced hero. Now, one of the most popular myths of our time is Star Wars. And in fact, George Lucas has explicitly said that he used a lot of Campbell's work when he created Star Wars. And really, we see this kind of mentor-hero progression in the Star Wars franchise, right? We have Qui-Gon, who passed his skills to Obi-Wan, who passed his skills to Luke, who, again, passed his skills to Rey. And I really found that this cycle was really compelling. But there was a problem. It seemed to involve passing down a lightsaber, which I don't have a lot of. And Jedi seemed to not live very long. And so that was a problem. Though I guess eternity as a force ghost is a pretty good retirement plan. But I needed more rigor in how I thought about leadership. And so my journey went to more structured books. So I left kind of the fantasy sci-fi world, and I went into more structured work. And when I was in college, toward my later years, I was introduced to a book called The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, which is a great book about leadership. And there are obviously a lot of leadership laws that Maxwell shares, but the one that I like the best is this one, which is the law of influence. And that is true leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And as I began to read more books, I came across this book called Leadership by James McGregor Burns, and he said this, that there are really two types of leadership. There's the transactional leaders, and that's, if you scratch my back, then I'll scratch yours. And I think we've all worked for those leaders, and most of us, if you're like me, don't like that. It's a very, if I give you this and you like it, then you'll give me something that I like. But a far more powerful leadership style is the transformational leader. And the transformational leader uses influence, right? There's that word again. She uses her influence to lead her team. She uses her charisma and her enthusiasm to influence her followers to raise their level of performance. And so I realized that if I'm going to be a great technical lead, if I'm going to be an effective leader of my technical teams, if I'm going to make sure that the DevOps folks and the developers and the designers and all the people on my cross-functional team can really operate at the highest level, then I really have to master influence. And that I needed to make sure that my influence was maximized so that I could become the best leader. But I realized that I needed something very similar to what most of you use today. I needed to understand smells, right? Most of you know code smells. And you know that when you're looking at code, it's not things that are going to break the code, but there are things that you realize you need to refactor. Maybe it's a really large class, or it's something that it's just not good practices. And so as we go throughout our coding journeys, we often develop a keen sense of these code smells, and we begin to know that if I'm going to maintain this code, then I need to make changes to it. And I realized that I needed something like code smells. I needed influence smells. I needed the ability to look at my team, look at my business partners, look at our products, and become keenly aware and quickly understand when things are smelling bad and to quickly take corrective actions. And I first came across the way that I would really bake into my leadership style this idea of influence when I went to a meeting back in 2004. It was my first stand-up, and I thought, cool, this is a meeting when I just stand up. And for a long time, I thought that Scrum was just standing up during meetings. And I know some of you did too. But over time, I practiced Scrum. I'm a certified Scrum Master now, and I realized that there's so much more to Scrum than just standing up. And to understand the power of Scrum and Agile and the other Agile practices, it's really important that we go back to the beginning. It's really important that we go back to the revolution that started what we now know as the Agile Manifesto. Now, Agile has become, in many ways, a marketing term, unfortunately, but there's a lot of power behind Agile, and I use a lot of the values of the Agile Manifesto in my personal life. But let's go back to how it started. Back in February 2001, 17 people got together. They were actually on vacation at a ski lodge in Utah, and they wanted to find better ways to improve software development. They obviously talked about diversity and inclusion as well, as you can tell. But they came from different backgrounds. Some of them had done extreme programming or XP. Some of them had done what was back then early Scrum. Some of them did different ways of lightweight software development. But they eventually came up with what we call the Agile Manifesto. And really, the Agile Manifesto, and a lot of people skip over this first sentence, but they said we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. And that's really important because the Agile Manifesto is not the Bible. It's not the Quran. It's not chiseled in stone, right? Back when they were doing this, they were uncovering different ways. And all of you are also uncovering better ways of building software. And I hope that you're not taking the Agile Manifesto and thinking that this is a rigid structure that I have to follow, but that you're also finding better ways on your teams to make them better fit to serve your customers. But there are 4 values in the Agile Manifesto, right? And so these values are individuals' interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and then responding to change over following a plan. And if you're in Agile, I hope that you've seen this before. I hope that you're at least familiar with them. But I'm going to go through each one and share lessons that I've applied to my leadership style. And I hope I can share ways that you too can apply these to how you lead your teams or how you like to be led when you're on teams. And I also want to just say that this is really key, that there's value in the items on the right, but we value the items on the left more. And I'll get more into this, but this does not mean that we don't do documentation. Doesn't mean that we don't have contracts, but it just means that when it comes to building software, we emphasize certain things more than others. So the first Agile value is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I want to take this and share with you a leadership lesson that will help you with what I call your build influence, your ability to influence the products and services that your team builds. Now, the reason that Agile values individuals and interactions is because, at least for now, if you're going to build code, you need people. Now, maybe someday when we get the singularity and Skynet comes online, they won't need us anymore. But for the most part, and for most of our lifetimes, you're going to have people to build code. But they can't just be any people. One of the key principles of Agile is that these are motivated individuals, that they're interactive. And there are a lot of ways that you can motivate a team and try to optimize how they interact, and I've seen a lot of them. Some people try open floor plans, some people try pool tables and gaming machines, or some people put alcohol around the office, and those are interesting ways, but a lot of them can be ineffective and even counterproductive. And there are a lot of people who have tried to write better books about how you motivate people. Daniel Pink wrote a book where he said that autonomy, mastery, and purpose are great ways to drive people. There's been other books about the power of recognition, and that people often, just by recognizing their work, you can motivate them. But I found one simple way to motivate my teams, and that is to honor the basic human dignity of everyone I work with. So preserve dignity at all cost. That's the first lesson. Preserve dignity at all cost. And it's really easy to dignify allies or people who you like, but you really need to also dignify people who you don't like or who disagree with you. And that's hard, But if we're going to honor the dignity of everyone on our teams, then we have to include people who we personally may not gel with very well. And I think that as we do this, we will build more team influence. And as you build your influence with your team, then they will trust you more. Now, I had a situation of learning this lesson early in my career, but I want to share a fairly recent example of how I learned how to apply this leadership lesson. So I set up a Slack group when I joined the company, and many of you probably use Slack, and I love Slack. I think it's the best tool in its class. And we were beginning to get more people joining our Slack channels, and we had an emoticon language that was amazing. We could communicate with a simple, GIF, and we were building a great team culture in our Slack channels, and I really was happy with that. But there was an issue that someone brought to my attention. Someone on our team made a joke about bacon, and when I saw it, I didn't think anything of it, but then a team member pulled me aside and said that she really took a little bit of, she was offended by the joke. And I'm thinking, well, who doesn't like bacon? I mean, I have bacon in my backpack in the other room from this morning, and I'm going to eat later. I love bacon. And so she was from Malaysia. And there are certain religions where bacon and anything dealing with pigs are very sensitive. And so, this was someone who I disagreed with because I initially thought, well, I outranked this person. She reports to someone who I'm a peer with, and I could have just brushed it off. But then I thought, preserve dignity at all costs. And so what I did is that I realized that even tools like Slack have cultural and ethical implications. So I told her that you're right. It's really important that we build a culture that is inclusive and welcoming to everyone, and that everyone who interacts with the company through any channel should see that welcoming environment. And so I let her know that I would address her comments and her concerns, and so I posted, I pinned to the channel a code of conduct that I found online. And I realized that I needed to honor her dignity by doing that, but I also had to verbally honor her dignity. And, I saw a slight dip in activity in Slack for a while, and I didn't like that. But I found that there were no further crude remarks or jokes, and, I may have lost a few people who were interactive in Slack, and they may have quieted down, but, I actually gained a lot more. This person went on to work with me on a future project, and we were a great team. And I think that a big part of that was because I respected her essential human dignity. Dignity always outranks the chain of command. Dignity always does better than any toy or perk that you can plant around the office. And dignity also has to be spoken, so at the next team meeting, I announced to the team why I did what I did and why it was important that we make sure that every contact point on the team is inclusive. And dignity has to be spoken because where there is silence, people fill in the blanks with their assumptions. And you have to let people know that you honor their dignity. Because honestly, there's so much toxicity often in technology that people may assume that it's not there. Because a lot of people come from environments where it's not. So dignity has to be acted on, but it also has to be spoken. So the next Agile value is working software over comprehensive documentation. And this is a lesson that will help you build your influence over what your team builds. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't do documentation, but it just means that we don't do excessive documentation. And my career goes back to the 90s. I'm kind of old. I remember binders of documentation that once you printed it was immediately obsolete and was almost never updated when you changed the code. So we do have documentation in Agile, but it's usually the minimal documentation that we need to be productive. So we create user stories that document the acceptance criteria, the assumptions of the work. We also include a definition of done, which how we know that we're done. So we have lightweight documentation, not zero documentation, but lightweight. And it's really easy to fall into the trap of trying to get the perfect documentation. And we avoid that in Agile by keeping it lightweight. And I found that by focusing on getting things working instead of documenting, then you actually build your influence, which leads to our second leadership lesson, which is working always ships faster than perfect. Working always ships faster than perfect. As a tech lead or as a technical leader, you're going to build more than just software. But this lesson also applies. And I do subscribe to make it work, make it right, and make it fast. And that applies to not just software, but to anything that your team is going to create. So a few years ago, I was working as a technical lead for a company, and my team was dispersed all around the globe, and one of our customers was in Asia, and they had an outage. And my support team in North America was basically not on call during the outage, so I had to build a way to deal with this. And so I called my team, and I said, hey, I have someone in India who's closer to Asia, and therefore we can create maybe some working hours to handle those support calls. And we started doing all this documentation about time zones and trying to figure out mapping from North America to India to Asia, and we were spending hours. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Let's just give this person a phone, this person in India, and let's just see what happens. Let's see how many tickets come in when this person is working. And over a couple months period, we had one call during that time. I got something working, and then we realized that we were saving ourselves a lot of headache by trying to over-document the situation. And so we got working, and working always ships better, faster than perfect. So the next leadership lesson is about your customers. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And this is a way to build customer influence. Now, again, this does not mean that we don't have contracts. Over my career, I've written a lot of statements of work that define the contract between my team and the customer. But it does mean that we try to have lightweight contracts. We also make sure that contracts are not the root of our relationship with our customers. And I've learned this lesson, and that's the third lesson, that customers trust colleagues, not contracts. They don't read the contracts anyway. I've had many contracts signed that I know the customer didn't read because they would bring up questions and like, that's the first paragraph of the SOW. And so I find that the contracts are important, but what's more important is to treat customers like colleagues instead of written agreements. And by doing that, you'll have better customer influence. And I've learned this in my career by working with a customer who we were trying to build an interface with this team. And so there were developers that the customer was going to provide and developers that my company was going to provide. And the initial approach was to have them separate, right? So we would build our work, and then at the end of each sprint, we would try to look over and see that they do their work. But I've seen this not work very well before. So I said, let's make one Scrum team across two companies. And so by doing that, we all had our daily stand-ups. We all had sprint planning together. We all went against the same sprint burn-down chart. We were much more effective in getting that work done. In fact, we finished early. And I realized that, man, by treating this customer like a colleague and not like a contract, I got far better results than if I had done it the other way around. And so it's really important that you treat your customers like colleagues and not like contracts. Now, that doesn't mean that the customer's always right. And I'm going to give y'all some real talk. And that's why we come to DevOpsDays, right, for real talk. Your customers aren't always right. And there are toxic customers. And there are times where you say, you know what, I'm going to refund your money and we can part ways. That should be rare, but you should be prepared to do that if you're going to be a technical leader. And that's just the real talk of working software. Now, I think that the reason that the Manifesto put responding to change, customer and customers and working with them after individuals and interactions and after working software is because if you build your influence with your people inside your company and you build your influence with how they build software, then you'll be better positioned to handle toxic customers because you have your team on your side, you have your quality also on your side, and then you'll be very much better prepared to handle toxic customers. So let's talk about influence with your team and your product and your customers. Let's talk about your schedule. So the Agile value, responding to change of following a plan, does not mean that you don't have a plan, right? In Scrum, we have something called sprint planning that we do every 2 weeks. So we do have planning, but it's kind of minimum viable planning, right? We do enough to know what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks, but we don't think that we can predict the future with any kind of accuracy, because in software development, there's always new growth. There's always something that we didn't anticipate happening, and we have to be flexible enough to deal with it, and we should really embrace change instead of just trying to tolerate change. And what we do in Scrum is that we dissect time into time slices called sprints, and then we work on the sprint, and then we learn from that sprint, and we iterate, and we get better. And so the lesson I want to share with you from this value is don't fear surprises, fear inflexibility. Fear inflexibility. You have to develop flexibility if you're going to be an effective technical leader. Surprises will happen. Accept that as just a simple truth. But the key is being flexible when you're navigating those surprises. And by building flexibility into your schedule, you'll be far more better positioned to deal with them when surprises happen. So here's an example of how I learned this lesson. A few months ago, I was working on a web audit, so we had these WCAG rules about accessible websites, and that mean that you had to have certain markup and how you constructed the site so that screen readers like JAWS could properly access it. And so there was an audit done, and there were all these things that were violations. And so my job was to lead the team through this. And so my counterpart on the client side felt, well, let's just create this massive plan in all this detail that we would use to go through each audit violation and then hope that after 2 months that we'll be done. And I was like, that's ridiculous. That's not a way to do this. Let's be agile. Let's take the most important violations and then figure out how many of them can be done in a sprint, and let's iterate through them and try to get them done. And by doing that, by doing the most valuable audit violations first, and they're often the most challenging, we built in what we learned from that into the next sprint. And we actually ended up getting done a lot earlier because I built flexibility into the schedule. I didn't create this fixed plan that was baked in gold and then followed exactly, but I was flexible enough to get to success, and we actually got done a lot earlier than before. And so by continuously improving ourselves, we got to a much better outcome. So don't fear surprises, fear inflexibility. And, flexibility is also a great value for ourselves personally, because you're not really a leader. And many of you probably have the title tech lead or lead developer, but you're not really a lead or a leader, because you're always becoming the leader that you're going to be. And so you have to be flexible in how you work with your teams. Often you have to be flexible in the people who you work with and how you approach them. And so it's very critical to have flexibility in yourselves. So these are the 4 leadership lessons from Agile Manifesto. Preserve dignity at all costs. That's people influence. Working always ships faster than perfect. That's product influence. Customers trust colleagues, not contracts. That's customer influence. And don't fear surprises, fear flexibility. And that's schedule influence. And I really think that these are powerful ways to develop your ability to detect influence smells and to be able to respond to them. And, leadership is about making decisions. And when you make decisions, then this is a great set of rules to run those choices through. And you'll be able to determine, well, am I undermining my people influence by making this decision? Am I locking myself into an inflexible schedule that's going to hurt me by making this decision? And it's really important that we understand that these all intersect as well, meaning that you may have a great developer who is amazing, the mythical 10x developer, but what if this person is toxic and people don't like working with him? And so this person may help you with your people influence, or may help you with your build influence, or with your build because they're a great developer, but it'll hurt your people. And you have to make a call about that and figure out, well, how can I juggle these 2 competing items and help my team be more effective? And I usually suggest getting that person off your team as soon as possible. It's really important that we also think about, well, there are features that we may be building that may hurt our customers. We've seen big companies like Uber and Volkswagen create features that actually hurt their customers. And at some point, a developer was approached and said, do this. And that developer did not have the integrity to say no. And so it's really important that we follow these Agile values, these principles, these leadership lessons, and it's hard, right? Agile is simple, but it's also hard. And leadership is the same. It's simple, but also hard. And I've used these leadership lessons to grow as a leader, and I've seen them work well with others. So no matter where you are on your journey as a software developer or as a leadership, if you optimize your influence with your people and what you build and your customers and the schedule, then you maximize the trust that people put in you and your team and your products, and then you move from a transactional leader to a transformational leader. So next time you face a leadership lesson, when you're in doubt, then I think you'll find a great set of leadership instincts in the Agile Manifesto. Thank you.